Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today we have Jonah Sachs on the podcast. Jonah is an author, speaker, storyteller, designer, and entrepreneur. He's the author of Winning the Story Wars, Why Those Who Tell and Live the Best Stories Will Rule the Future, and most recently, Unsafe Thinking, How to Be Nimble and Bold When You Need It Most. Thanks for chatting with me today, Jonah.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's great to be here.
Cool. Well, we got some mutual interests, don't we?
Yeah, definitely. Your last book, Wired to Create, was a big inspiration for me in writing this book. So,
Oh,
yeah,
wow, I didn't know that.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
great. Well, I'm honored to hear that. Yeah, it's a great book that you wrote and, a lot of, like I said, a lot of mutual topics that we're interested in. So the thing with that is it's always difficult to be like, where do I start? When you have like so many topics that are interesting. But I'll start with, it's in the title of your book, safe thinking, right? So what is the safe thinking cycle?
So, the safe thinking cycle is this idea that we get into this place with a changing world in which we get a certain amount of threat awareness no matter what we do. If we're being unsuccessful in our work, we start to get nervous that there's, threats to our well-being. But even if we reach high levels of success, what we were doing yesterday probably isn't going to be working tomorrow. So, how do we respond to that threat awareness is the beginning of the safe thinking cycle. And of course, we're programmed by evolution and biology to respond to threat awareness with, a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of fear. And back on the savanna of the African plains for our earliest ancestors, we would greet that fear by narrowing our thinking, and we would, our vision would get very acute, but our peripheral processing would slow down so that we could run or fight. Now, the more that we think in stereotypical ways when creativity is needed, of course, the more threat awareness we're going to find. So we get nervous, we start to think we got to change, but then our change kind of neurons start to shut down and we start to think we just got to do something quickly. We got to do what worked last time. We got to do what someone else is doing that's working. We face a novel challenge with stereotypical thinking as we're programmed to do. And so we greet change with, I'll do what worked for somebody else. I'll do what worked last time. I'll do what I can do quickly and get it over with. And that doesn't allow us to actually open up and find the novel creative solutions that we need, leading to more threat awareness because we're still sinking deeper and deeper into the problem that we originally faced because we don't have new creative thinking. And so that cycle can just keep going and going. We keep making that safest, most obvious choice, and the pressure keeps rising and we're not breaking out. And that is a big thing I'm exploring in the book is how do you actually break out of that cycle as the pressure gets more and more because you're not changing?
Yeah, that's great. And do you go in and consult for companies and help them break out? Like, do you show up, you're like, I'm going to help you all break out today, like, do you inspire them? I bet you do, right?
Yeah, so I started my career 17, 18 years ago doing social change communications on the internet. So, earliest viral videos, social change viral videos I was doing for environmental groups and for human rights groups. And I found that while creating a great piece of media could sort of change an organization, really the work of helping to tell a better story was really about looking at, what are we doing? What are we stuck in? And why aren't we making the social change that we want to make? How do we actually start to change ourselves and our organization? So I started drifting further and further away from just doing communications into looking at how to open up the creativity of an organization. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of that work now.
This is a bit of a tangent, but you just had me thinking, there's some people that like social change, that phrase has that almost like in certain circles, in the political sphere has become like a negative phrase. What's up with that? Like, what do you think's going on in the cultural trends of, because there's a huge like cultural war going on. People even like say, there was a time when saying cultural change was like a wonderful, beautiful, thing. And then if you don't want to get
Yeah,
into that, that's fine.
yeah, no, I mean, I think we live in a pretty cynical time where
Yes, that's a
similar
good point.
with
Yeah. If you
you
if
know,
you if you came on my show and you're like, "Hi, my name is Jonah. I'm a social justice warrior," I'd be like, "Okay." I don't.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that we live in a time where sort of every term becomes contested, right? And
Yeah,
every
yeah,
intention gets questioned and can be turned against us. I think the idea of social change really, though, is about people who are trying to devote their careers and their time to bringing their values out into the world. And that's it's kind of the heart of democracy. So I would say, hopefully that never goes out of style for people to be out in the public square fighting for what they believe in, whether it's what I believe in or something else. I think we need to keep that going. So I'm not backing away from it.
Yeah, so what role does intuition play in this creative process? I'm trying to link, you do talk about intuition, but also how it can lead to bias thinking. It's not always bad, it's not always good, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I actually started by looking into counterintuition because I was thinking so much creativity comes from ideas that on the surface seem, crazy, just kind of against the grain and make no sense from an intuitive perspective. But oftentimes what's intuitive can be just sort of conventional wisdom disguised inside of our own brains. Like, oh no, no one would ever get into a stranger's car and use it as a taxi. That's not safe. Well, it turns out it's the most intuitive way now of traveling. But it takes someone seeing that you don't just dismiss every idea that runs counter to the way we currently do things to bring an idea like that forth. So I started looking into, all the flaws of intuition. And certainly, as Daniel Kahneman says and many others, there's this, fast processing that instantly, you know, looks at patterns and dismisses ideas and puts things in boxes. And that can be very dangerous, right? It helps us process the world, but also can lead to racial bias, gender bias, or just general creative bias that keeps us locked in that sort of safe thinking. But like so many other things I've discovered in this book, you can't live without intuition too, and you can't be creative without intuition. So it's not. I wanted to write a chapter about how bad intuition was, but wound up writing three chapters. One all about the amazing subconscious processing power of intuition. Right. To be creative, you need to spot patterns that others aren't seeing. And our conscious mind only, takes in a small percentage of what we perceive. But our subconscious mind is constantly processing and pattern matching too. And then every once in a while, it'll shoot a aha moment up to the surface, and we get this rush, often through our body, a feeling in our body. Wow, that's a great idea. We can't just dismiss those things and say we're going to rely totally on data here. We're not going to listen to anyone's intuition. We're not going to listen to John because he doesn't have any way to justify it. It's just coming from his intuition. We actually should put intuition at the front of our consideration when we're looking at new ideas. But we also do need to analyze it and see, is this true intuition? Is this just true pattern matching? Or is this conventional wisdom or bias disguised as intuition? I spoke to Robin Hogarth, who's one of the most foremost researchers on intuition. And he basically told me that, intuition are brilliant ideas that need to be deeply interrogated and questioned. And I thought that that was, probably about the right way to look at it.
They're not always brilliant ideas though, right?
Right, right. They're ideas
Sometimes my
worthy of
intuition
consideration.
sucks.
Yeah, yes, of course. So I did research on Silicon Valley investors who are people who are paid millions of dollars essentially for their brilliant intuition. And researchers who have talked to them find that they rely more on intuition than they do on analysis. But their intuition is constantly steering them away from investments in female entrepreneurs who tend to actually outperform the market or their male counterparts. They get like a 34th of the amount of investment because the intuition says this woman doesn't look like someone we invested in before. This doesn't match the pattern, but the pattern is all wrong. And so even in these places where intuition is vaunted and these are the best intuitions in the world, they can easily get polluted and opportunities missed because of bias.
That's really interesting. Are you aware of all the controversies surrounding the IAT? Some of these in the field trying to measure implicit biases and,
Yeah.
criticisms of those measures and then questions about what is it really measuring? Is it measuring, are we unconsciously racist or biased, or are we just, we've soaked up the cultural norms at a subconscious level and there's no such thing as like, can your unconscious be sexist? You're just sexist if you act sexist, right? Or no, can you? What do you think? It's an interesting question though, isn't it?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it is an interesting question. I guess no, your subconscious doesn't have a free will. I guess if that's the question, and
Right.
it doesn't really impact. You can't be responsible for your subconscious in a way. Although I saw some interesting research from people who have been trying to educate their intuition. Essentially, like if you put up on your screen, some Harvard researchers were putting up on their screensavers kind of counter stereotypical images, just like when they looked at their screen, they would see a someone who doesn't belong in that role by stereotype. And by being confronted with images that are counter stereotypical every day for hours every day, apparently that helped to educate their underlying biases. So I think if you can expose yourself to things that counter your biases, you can re-educate your intuition. And so in those ways, we can be responsible for our subconscious thinking. If we keep ourselves in bubbles and constantly locked away, do have to take responsibility when our subconscious become more and more biased. So I actually, know that so much research is based on the IAT, but hadn't been aware of new controversies maybe around it. There's kind of a lot of conversations now about
There is,
sort of
like,
its.
are these measures reliable? Are these measures valid? What are they predicting, you know? A lot of
Mhm.
them don't necessarily predict explicit racism or explicit, you
Okay.
know?
Yeah.
So then the question is, like, if you're not explicitly doing it, like, are you racist? You know, are your thoughts bad in
Mhm,
themselves?
mhm.
Can you be a bad person if you just have bad thoughts in your life, but you do wonderful things? Isn't
Right.
that an interesting I mean, I think it's an interesting question,
Yeah.
you know?
We can impact our automatic thinking in a sense with new experiences, and so that's maybe the place where we can have some control.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And, I've always been interested with, I really like the dual process model of cognition, and Seymour Epstein's. That's my favorite out of all the thousand dual process models that exist in the field. The thing that's interesting about that, and also Keith Stanovich's dual process theory, is that you can separate out evolutionarily driven intuitions from like our learned intuitions throughout our own lifespan. And that's
Mm,
interesting to think that we have all sorts of different. We have intuition. We're being pulled in so many ways we don't even consciously realize.
yeah,
We're pulled by these evolutionary drives, and we're also pulled by these things that like our parents said to us when we were younger. That we don't want to be pulled by that anymore.
yeah,
So it's interesting, like how do you separate all these things? But the point you're making, which is excellent, really is the more conscious we can become of all of this, the better,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I spoke to Philip Tetlock, who's an expert on experts, and he was talking about how wrong experts often are, and how they're worse than dart throwing monkeys at at predicting the future. But when I asked him to kind of wrap up everything we were talking about, and what do you do about this, he just said the most valuable thing you can do is think about how you're thinking. Whatever kind of metacognition you can put on your own thought processes is time really well spent. And I thought that was a really nice wrap up, that we can't break free of all of our flawed thinking and of all of our human flaws. But if we do think about and observe the way that we think, and spend time watching ourselves think, we get smarter. I really like that advice.
Yeah, that's why meditation is so popular these days.
Yes.
As a one technique to do that. Yeah, so how can you challenge and change yourself when you need it most? It's not a very easy question, is it?
No, it's definitely not a one size fits all
Yeah.
solution on that. But I looked at it a couple different ways. Essentially, I think there are many, many ways that we can have strengths with our thinking. Some people have learned to rely on their intuition, for instance. Other people have learned to rely on analysis. Some people are really invested in expert thinking, while other people are more sort of dilettantes and like to explore broadly. Some people spend, a huge amount of time outside their comfort zone and never really focus enough on deliberate practice, what they really need to get good at. And what I push in the book is this idea that kind of whole brain thinking and whole brain behavior is really what's powerful. So if there are things that you've left behind and say, I'm just not good at X, Y, and Z, and you spend all your time chewing away on the things that you're really good at, the time spent outside of your area of expertise, outside of your comfort zone, with people that you don't like to associate with or don't agree with, in uncomfortable situations, that time is the highest growth potential time. And so finding how to use those parts of yourself, and the book looks at many of those different pieces. So some parts will resonate with some readers more than others, I think. But how do you dip your toes into your weaknesses and focus on what you're not good at? That is the most direct way of starting to break those habits and ruts and patterns. This idea of deliberate practice, by the way, which I may be familiar with, is the best musicians in the world don't practice longer than other musicians, and they don't do different exercises. But what they do is they stay on the parts of the music that they are the worst at, and they really pick away at that until they get good at it. While other people tend to really enjoy doing what they're best at, and that seems to be what pulls them apart. And so that's one of the things I really look at, is sort of how do you create those uncomfortable situations and enjoy getting outside of your routines and patterns, which is hard because the human brain is definitely programmed to enjoy being in pattern and routine. And then the other thing, I relied and spoke with Teresa Amabile at Harvard, who I know and she really talks about the context of creativity being very important too. That it's not just about you being creative; it's about where are you? Are you around the right kinds of people? Are you in the right processes? What's the environment? And how do you change that environment to unlock your own creativity? Because I think there is this feeling of like it's a innate talent and skill and something we need to draw forth. But in fact, sometimes changing our collaborators, our situation, helps it burst out of us.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about Storyworth, a really cool new way to deepen connections with your family and loved ones. Storyworth makes it easy and fun for your loved ones to share their stories. Here's how it works. Once you purchase a subscription for someone you love, each week Storyworth will send that person an email with a question about their life. After a year of these weekly prompts, they'll get their stories bound in a beautiful hardcover printed book. The loved one can write stories and upload photos by email or on the web, and you can invite an unlimited number of people to receive the stories. You can also save and edit all of your stories on storyworth.com. The data is secure and everything is private by default. You control who sees your stories. This is a great gift for the holidays for the loved ones in your life who enjoy telling stories, and it's a really great way to learn about your relatives. Questions often elicit entertaining, surprising, and sometimes moving responses. This is also a great way to preserve your memories, and you can pass on the book to your children and their future families. Personally, I decided to give the book to my best friend, my dad. I expect he'll tell the story of our trip to Australia as one of his most enjoyable times spent with me. Flying on that long flight across the world was not easy, but being with your best friend makes it a lot easier. I really like Storyworth because it gives me an opportunity to really capture my dad's experiences and thoughts in a meaningful fashion, and in a way that I can easily return to again and again. I have a special offer today for listeners of the Psychology Podcast. For $20 off your first subscription, visit storyworth.com/TPP. That's storyworth.com/TPP for $20 off your first subscription.
Now, the word creativity doesn't appear in your book title whatsoever, but this is fundamentally a book about creativity in organizations and entrepreneurs, anyone who wants to be creative. Would some of these principles not apply? You already said there's no one size fits all. Are there situations where some of these principles wouldn't apply if you have to meet a deadline tomorrow and your client doesn't want you to be creative?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I guess there's two things. I think Adam Grant spoke about it really well in Originals, where he talks about that portfolio of risk, I think he calls it. This idea that we can't be on that creative edge at all times. It's totally exhausting and it's not appropriate. And nobody really wants to be around the guy who wants to break everything all the time. So in some ways, the title, with the exploding light bulb on the cover, is maybe a little bit misleading in that I'm not saying that you need to be this sort of provocateur at all times. So we do need to think about when we want to push risk. But I think we all know in our lives that there are times where we're like, I need to get out of this pattern. I need to change this. And then we fail to do it. This is a book about really when to do that and how to do it. And then, John Cleese, who's a favorite of mine from Monty Python, he
Me
talks about
too.
the open. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
wonderful. He's hilarious and brilliant. And he talks about the open and closed mode, which I know you wrote about something quite similar about this idea that there are times in the creative process where we need to go wide and really get out and just get as many ideas and unusual collaborations and break expectations. And then there are times where we just need to buckle down and focus. And we don't need to be questioning again and don't need to be opening up Pandora's box at all times. And to really know where you are in the creative process and to stay in creative flow, you need to sort of be able to map and say, now is time to push ourselves to the edge. It's time for intrinsic motivation. It's time for play, and now it's time for execution. It's time to focus on extrinsic motivation. It's time to dive deeply and execute. And then we're going to commit to this idea, and then we'll test it and go back to the creative mode again if we need to. So understanding where you are, and this is not just creativity for creativity's sake, I think is helpful. One thing about old style books about creativity that I don't like, the earlier generation, is profiling these creative geniuses and being like, look at this amazing creative genius and how did they do it, in a way that sort of takes away from the reality of what we have to do every day, this iconoclast. So this is, I know that it's sort of the part of a new generation of creativity books, I think, that try to make it more accessible to everyday people and not just look at Steve Jobs and how he did what he did.
So, are you referring to Frank Barron's books, or what are some old school ones you're referring to?
Well,
Like
there's like a
how old are we talking?
Well, there's I think maybe sort of 10 years back, but
Okay, just 10 years.
or yeah, there's just sort of a lot of portraits of creativity, portraits of great artists, and there's some amazing books like that as well, but that sort of use these case studies that feel inaccessible, I guess, in a sense. And I know that I try to use a bunch of case studies that of kind of everyday people who have done extraordinary things. And so,
Yeah, so there are these different phases of the creative process. And I want to return to that idea, and I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And then you talk about the collaboration. So when there's the part of the creative process where you need to collaborate with others, what's the effect of collaborating with people who only share your values? I love
so
working with people who only share my values. It's very fun. I'm not
yeah.
joking.
No, I know. I mean, I started a creative agency based on values, and I had all kinds of litmus tests about who I wanted to have in the
Mm,
company.
mm,
And that's the same as like Google, hiring for culture. We see it; it's accepted as this sort of, are you going to fit in? Are you going to add to the ease and comfort of this organization so that we can get our work done effectively? And the problem with that is, it reinforces biased thinking. It makes everybody feel good on the team, but they're spending more time making each other feel good and happy and not challenging each other. There's experiments that find that handpicked teams of experts who share experience and perspectives underperform on creativity tasks. Random groups of beginners, because these random groups of beginners just see the world totally differently. And so new and novel ideas can come forth. But there's something kind of even deeper, I think, which is that when we enforce strict moral codes, it's okay to talk about this. It's not okay to talk about that. This is in bounds. This is out of bounds. We just shut down so many different avenues for exploration. So I profile a pastor in the book who was trying to fight crime in his neighborhood and stop violence in his neighborhood. And it was when he was working with the at-risk youth, he wasn't getting anywhere. But when he was working with the kids, when he stepped out and started hanging out with the kids who were actually committing the crimes, the murderers on his block, all these ideas started bursting forth. And he was part of the Boston Miracle that saw, a 66% drop in Boston in murders, because he actually started looking for creative solutions with the enemy. And so I just think that organizations that are trying to get too comfortable and too safe by having people who don't rock the boat at all create huge problems and that we all need to sort of stop thinking that we'll be polluted by hanging out with people who don't share our values and start believing we don't need to change their minds, they don't need to change ours, to both get more creative just by being exposed to each other.
mm. So we should collaborate with our enemies.
I think so. I think we
Yeah.
can. It's uncomfortable, but we can. And I found it's really hard to do that online actually. So there's some interesting experiments that just show that people just get further entrenched in their thinking when exposed to other people's to counter thinking online, but face to face, we are much more likely to learn when we encounter another human being and can't reconcile. Oh, this person's pleasant and nice, and we're having a good conversation. That allows us to open up to new ideas in a way that watching, ranting on a message board does not at all. It just that further entrenches us in our thinking.
Cool. Hey everyone, just wanted to take this moment to thank you all for your support of the podcast over the years. It's been a real privilege to do this podcast for you all for the past 4 years. If you'd like to further support the podcast, I wanted to let you know a few things you could do to help make this podcast a better experience for you all. First, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. This would help make the show more prominent on iTunes and increase our listenership. I believe you can subscribe both on your iPhone and on your computer. Second, it'd be great if you could give the show a rating and review on iTunes. I definitely read all the reviews, and they are helpful to others who are thinking about giving the show a listen. Another thing you can do, which is new, is to become a patron of the show by going to www.patreon.com/psychpodcast. That's www.patreon.com/psychpodcast. There are various options that you can select, which include the ability to ask your own questions to a guest on the show and to have a 30-minute Skype session with me. Thanks again for your incredible support of the show over the years. I do this show for you all because I truly love sharing my enthusiasm and love of the mind, brain, and creativity, and I really appreciate you joining me on this journey. Okay, now back to the show. So we talked about collaboration, and I want to talk about motivation a little bit. How do you stay motivated? Are there any tips, that you talk about in your book? How to stay motivated when changing habits is so hard, and that seems to be kind of the default state, is not wanting to change your habits.
Yeah. So, the thing that I kind of found to be most interesting about motivation is we think a lot about the content of what we're doing. Is this thing inherently motivating? Do I want to do this thing? Does this align with my deepest life purpose? And if yes, we'll be motivated. And if no, we won't be motivated. So we need to keep looking for that thing that turns us on. But creativity is a grind a lot of times. Building anything new and special, it doesn't always feel good. And even if we are aligned to our deepest life purpose, does that mean that we're going to stay energized? And often, no, through all the failure and setbacks. And yet, people do things all the time that are not inherently motivating at all. Like they play video games and they grind away for hours and hours with complete focus without sort of stepping back and asking why. It has nothing to do with their life's purpose, but they're so motivated to beat it. And so that has to do with, in many ways what, flow theory tells us, which is kind of what I based, a lot of people talk about. I base some of my thinking on is that if you have that right mix of challenge and skill, and the challenge is just beyond your skill level, that brings forth a ton of motivation and that brings forth excitement and play. And that's why video games are just inherently so addictive and fun. They just keep us just beyond our skill level. So instead of stepping back and asking all the time, do I want to do this? Does this align with what I'm most meant to do? Once we've committed to something, the most important thing to step back is say, how are my skills right now matched to this challenge? And do I need to sort of tune up my skills or bring in other people to add to that motivation so we can get up to that level we need to be? Or do I need to tune down the challenge or tune up the challenge? And working at that level of more, how do I get into sort of creative flow by being well matched for the challenge I'm facing is more important in some ways than questioning the content of what we're doing all the time. So, I give kind of a lot of tips for how to question whether you or your team are in a state of flow when you're trying to be creative and how to add in or subtract some of that challenge so that you get to that right place. And so it's a little bit of a twist, I think, on the usual, declare your purpose statement and then maniacally follow it, which I think is a little misguided at times.
Yeah, I feel you. I feel you, brother. But thing that in the field, there's this debate, another debate between what is the difference or similarities between flow and deliberate practice, because they seem to be almost opposite things, or are they not? Angela Duckworth talks about this debate in her book Grit. Is like, when you're in the flow state, you're not deliberately, consciously trying to push beyond your comfort zone. You're kind of in the flow. That's the whole. That's the word
Yeah.
flow.
Yeah. All right, now you're asking me to definitely weigh in with some of the true experts in the field and the
Yeah.
and the degrees. So I will do so very cautiously. But
I
the
respect
way that
that.
I understand the
Mhm.
way that I understand it is that we engage in deliberate practice doesn't necessarily put us in flow. In fact, it can be horribly difficult. We aren't experiencing flow at that time, but we do deliberate practice so that we can return to flow when we are performing our creative work. So I'm trying to get something done. I hit a wall. I feel that motivation flagging. It's no fun anymore. I want to put it aside and I don't know why. And I realize, actually, I don't know how to do this thing. Or I don't have the resources that I need to do this thing. So I'm just grinding and banging my head against it. What happens if I step back? And yes, it's going to slow down the project. It's going to slow down my performance. I step back and I go and learn that thing. I work on that thing. That's where deliberate practice comes in. Now I'm a little bit better at it. Now I come back at it and, oh, I can do it. Video games the same way, right? Like I'm trying to beat this boss and I can't. I need to go back and get the right tools. And that maybe not as fun, but I go get the right weapon. Now I come back and I fight. It's a sort of similar practice with building something, which is, step away, learn, come back, return to flow. Easier said than done, but that's how I'd see them together. I don't see us getting into flow in deliberate practice, but the researchers may know more than I do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your perspective. They're both clearly important. We can agree on that.
Yeah.
So why can anxiety be a fuel for creativity? We've talked about why anxiety sucks, right? But
Yeah.
why?
Yeah, yeah. So when I was looking at this safe thinking cycle, I thought, okay, so threat awareness leads to anxiety, which leads to stereotypical thinking. How do we avoid feeling anxiety? How do we get out of that? And in the research that I looked at, it was like you can't actually avoid feeling anxiety. And the more that you try to steel yourself against feeling anxiety, the more anxiety you're likely to feel, right? So, like when you push against a natural response, you're going to feel that response even more deeply. So, instead of thinking, how do I stay away from and guard against feelings of anxiety, is how do I reframe a feeling of anxiety? What do I do when I'm told, uh-oh, this doesn't feel good. This feels frightening. How do I respond to that? And so a lot of the research I looked at said, we have that opportunity to reframe. If we tell ourselves, I've never done anything creative without feeling anxiety. Anxiety may be a sign that I am pushing to that edge of the known. Anxiety may be a sign that I'm taking a risk, and risk is an inherent part of building something new. we can actually say, I want to move towards that anxious experience, not away, because it's not really a threat to my well being and my safety. It's just a sign that I'm pushing into the unknown. And that kind of self talk, while sounding very simple, was pretty common to the 50 to 60 entrepreneurs that I talked to, who all said, yeah, I know an idea is not going to be good if I feel comfortable the whole time through. And so, yeah, starting to think about when I feel anxious, tell myself that that is fuel or a sign that creativity is emerging, can have a profound impact. Although, of course, it takes practice. It's not, a single in a day you're suddenly moving towards anxiety, but it's an important piece of the puzzle.
Oh my gosh, does it take practice? I deliberately practice that one every day of my life.
How do you do it?
Through meditation, through changing my automatic pattern. A lot of what you're talking about, brother. I don't know why I keep calling you brother, but I'm in that mood, I guess, right now. But a lot of what you're talking about today, it's you gotta keep practicing it. You can so easily revert back to the default, right? It's so easy
Yeah,
to
it is so.
to think anxious is easy. Yeah,
Totally. And I think, I mean, you probably know this from meditation, that being kind and gentle with ourselves when we do fall back into our patterns, just like in meditation, if you start thinking, you don't berate yourself, you pull yourself gently back to focus. I think that's pretty critical as well, that we need to sort of understand that the default state is automatic thinking and pattern behavior, and accept that we're going to be doing that probably for the rest of our lives. But if we can break those patterns just a little bit, we can open up new possibilities, and investing the time and thinking into doing that is really well worth it.
agreed. Very much agreed.
So, I'd like to take a moment to talk about a cool new investing app called Robinhood. Robinhood lets you buy and sell stocks, ETFs, options, and cryptos all commission free. They strive to make financial services work for everyone, not just the wealthy. This app is a really non intimidating way for stock market newcomers to invest for the first time with true confidence. The app has a simple, intuitive, and clear design with data presented in an easy to digest way. Personally, I found Robinhood really easy to use, especially for someone who has had virtually no prior experience when it comes to investing. Other brokerages charge up to $10 for every trade, but I really like that Robinhood doesn't charge commission fees, so you can trade stocks and keep all of your profits. Also, I really like how you can discover new stocks and track your favorite companies with a personalized newsfeed. So, I have some good news. Robinhood is giving listeners of the Psychology Podcast a free stock like Apple, Ford, or Sprint to help build your portfolio. You can sign up at psychology.robinhood.com. That's psychology.robinhood.com. Good luck investing.
So let's talk about identity then. We talked about values. Okay, what's the difference between values and identity, first of all? Because you do talk about identity separately as well.
Yeah. So I got really interested in this, some of the research that said, if you say, I plan to vote, I'm going to vote in this election, versus I am going to be a voter in this next election. When you say I'm going to be a voter, I am a voter, we then take on that identity, and the action that goes with it becomes so much more important that we're much more likely to actually do it. Just getting someone to say, I plan to be a voter, will vastly increase the likelihood that they will vote in the next election versus I plan to vote. Because taking a commitment to take an action that doesn't tie to who we think we are is really different than an action that we do because, of course, someone like me would do this. We're always doing things to match our actions to who we think we are. It's kind of a primal force within us. So if we start to take on that identity of, I am an unsafe thinker, then suddenly unsafe ideas become attractive as opposed to just frightening. And so it's a little bit different than values. To say, I care about X, Y, and Z puts us at a little bit of a remove. But if you say, I'm someone who fights for X, Y, Z, that tends to give us a little bit more of that boost of motivation to actually do it. And so at the end of the book, I really talk about my own journey of asking, in the context of my company, and a point I got to in my career, what would an unsafe thinker do in this case? And that actually pushed me to sell my company and to move on from the only job I ever really had, because I realized I was at the end of my creative journey with it. So it had a profound impact on me. But I also think that just so many of the role models that we have right now are outdated, and we are building our identity as leaders and as collaborators and as creative people around sort of somewhat outmoded role models. So to see ourselves, for instance, to be a leader does not necessarily mean to be an expert. And many, studies have shown that people would rather follow a humble leader than a self-aggrandizing leader. And yet we get into that leadership role and we start having to project, expertise and power when really that doesn't necessarily feel comfortable to ourselves, and our followers don't really want that from us either. So, can we change some of those role models and change that identity to live up to something that's more relevant today? Is what I'm looking at.
Yeah, do you mind telling a little more of your personal story? You only, you just teased the listeners. What was the only job you ever had? Like, can you?
Sure.
Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, definitely. Not the easiest story in many ways to tell because it involves some failure that I wrestled with for quite some time, which is that when I was 23, I started an agency, like I said, to create social change, which I know is a contested term now. But
How dare you?
you know, to follow my values, I was kind of heavily into helping save the environment and human rights and workers' rights. And so we were making these early internet films that were getting people to take action on some of these issues. And we had some huge early successes. We're getting 20, 30 million people watching our things way before YouTube ever existed, leading to actions on the ground and protests and campaigns to Congress. And the company really kind of went well. Things were good. And so we grew to about 25 people, and people started asking, how do you do what you do? And how does it work? And I started giving talks. And that's when I discovered storytelling was really at the heart of what we were doing. It's like, oh, this is not just about cool technology or cool graphics or sounds or humor. This is about like these core stories that we're telling. And I got approached to write a book about storytelling, which I was, a beginner at in a way. I didn't know the theory and the history of storytelling or of advertising. So I dove in, wrote a book about storytelling, and suddenly I was like an expert in the field, right? I was traveling around the world, giving talks on stages, telling everyone how to do it. And that was bringing in all these clients. And they were expecting us to follow this pattern that I was now associated with. And so I had to start turning the company from something that was just sort of, it's called free range, it's kind of free ranging, kind of crazy creativity into something that was more structured. And we had more and more clients. We grew to 40 people, and we had a whole system that people were expecting from us. And I stopped being that beginner who was so in love with storytelling, who was trying to learn as much as possible, and I started to become more of that disciplinarian who was like, this is how we do it. And I'd go up on stage and
This
people
is
would
how we do it. This is how we
not be
do
fun.
it. Sorry. I just,
If only I
yeah,
had sung during those times, it might have
yeah.
helped. Uh,
Sorry, go on. That was very rude of me.
I'll look for other buzz terms you can jump in on. So so the company started to lose its creativity, and I started to lose my creativity as we grew. And it wasn't really obvious in the bottom line. It wasn't obvious in our growth, but I could feel that sense of we are losing that edge of play and fun and cutting edge creativity. And I'll tell you that trying to do anything on the internet marketing that's not cutting edge is, completely irrelevant in, 2 weeks later. And so I could really sense that the company was going to be kind of falling down on its face shortly if we didn't do something different. And if I didn't start letting go of that ego attachment to expertise, and if I didn't become an explorer again. And so, figuring out how to do that was really the foundation of writing this book. And, I kept running the company through the research for this book. But as I got done with the research, I realized that the grind of trying to move something from where I knew I needed to move it to somewhere else, I had changed the creative process in the company. I had changed the creative process in myself. Things were working much better, but I felt like now I'm at the end of this journey, and took a step that I never thought I could. I thought I would literally die as the CEO of this company. That was my goal, was to, just to
To
do it until
die?
I was no,
Oh,
to die old. But no, yeah, I thought that I would, do it till I was 75, and then I would, that would be, maybe I'd never retire, and I keep doing this thing that I loved. And it took me, changing my identity in a way to make that change, and to free myself up to do something different. And in some ways, it's a bit of an unknown. I'm launching a book. I'm speaking about it, and I don't know where it's going to lead. So for the first time ever,
it's important to know when to grit, and it's important to know when to quit.
that is right.
Did
That
I
is right.
summarize everything you just said pretty much that
Yes,
sentence?
you can edit all the rest out and just say that.
No, I'm not gonna edit out. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable with our audience. I always appreciate it when my guests do that. So I want to end with a question. How can you build an organization that embraces what you call intelligent risk?
Yeah. So at the end of the book, I really talk in the last couple of chapters about that. As leaders, what do we do to not just say, hey, I want more creativity from my company? Because we're all doing that as leaders, berating our people, saying, more creativity, please, and not always getting it. And so, what do you do? I looked at a couple of things that I think are particularly effective. One of them is ironically to me, that unsafe organizations are organizations actually that have a high level of inherent safety in them. So if you have this sort of freewheeling Wild West environment where everyone's competing and fighting with each other to be the most creative, people are going to stop taking risks. But once you make people feel inherently safe, I talked to Steve Kerr of the Golden State Warriors, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, and he said his first work when he came to the Warriors was to make everyone in the locker room, even though despite all the pressure to win, feel that they were inherently valued as human beings. And that's partly because he was an amazing 3-point shooter and one of the best ever. And he never
Clutch.
wanted to, yeah, very clutch. So he said that he was always afraid he was going to miss the shot and that he didn't really belong in the NBA. So he would always secretly not take the big shot. And then that time in the finals when Jordan had the flu, they dished to him and finally he put it up. Drained the shot, won the series, and he realized that he needed to get past that feeling that he was always on the bubble of being pushed off the team in order to take any risks. And he vowed when he became a coach that he would never have any players feeling that they were on the edge of being tossed out of the organization, that everyone, for as long as they were on the Warriors, would feel needed and important and loved. And that turned the team around hugely. Now, obviously, he's got a lot of talent on that team, but he was able to unlock it, I think, by making a very safe culture for experimentation and risk. And that's what we need to do in our organizations is if we want people to butt heads and disagree and fight it out and all that, we need to first establish that everyone is valued and safe in that organization and not have that kind of chaos where we're only rewarding people who create the results, where we're rewarding people for taking intelligent risks, where we're outwardly rewarding people for breaking rules that no longer make sense and telling those stories of how they broke those rules. We should be minimizing the number of rules in an organization, I found, so that anything that people are holding people back but are unnecessary, trusting our people more in a sense. And finally, we need to kind of be putting teams together in which very divergent views are expressed and allowed. One of the most interesting things I found in my research is this concept of shared information bias, which is a group gets together and they're most likely going to sit around and talk about what they all already know. What's the point of getting together? The point of getting together is to talk about the things that only a couple people know and everyone needs to know. And so, but that doesn't happen because we actually forget that outlying information the minute we get together and start discussing the stuff we already share in knowledge. And usually the people who are lower status in the group are going to hold that outside information because the boss has always been talking about the same thing. Everyone knows what the boss thinks, but few people know what the people on the edges think. So what we need to do is leaders need to speak last. We need to make sure everybody writes down what their unique contribution is before getting into a meeting, and then making sure everyone gets to speak before we end a meeting. So some research shows that meetings actually need to run a lot longer than they do, which I know a lot of people don't want don't want to hear. But to make sure that we're drawing that information from the edges to get that creative output and breakthrough is really important. So when we bring these diverse teams together, it's not enough to just bring diverse teams together, but to make sure those diverse ideas are being pulled forth. And that means the leader can't dominate the conversation. So yeah, a number of things organizations can't just say we want to be more creative, but really start building around a creative culture. There's a really surprising, fascinating study that I saw about how discussing political correctness made teams more creative. I don't know if this is, completely, it's very counterintuitive, but apparently because if you discuss political correctness first, it doesn't actually shut down the boundaries of what people are willing to talk about. It makes everyone feel safe enough that, like, okay, I'm diverse people when they get together feel like, okay, I'm safe in this group. We've discussed what feels comfortable. Now we can then go, knowing we care about each other, we can go out and take more risks by being vulnerable up front about our biases and our expectations. So I thought that kind of thing is interesting.
I
That
have a
making
cheeky
it safe.
question. I have a cheeky
Yes, yes,
question. But what if you have
yes.
people on the team that like are anti-political correctness? Like, aren't you making them feel uncomfortable?
Well, first of all, I didn't run this study, and I
Okay.
can't. It's a it
You
was a
can't.
well
Can you
quoted.
please everyone? It's like, is that
No,
realistic? Yeah.
but I talk a little bit about generally putting some distance. In a sense, the idea is to find a way to put some distance between disagreeing with ideas and just disagreeing with each other as people. So
Yeah.
this is maybe one way to do it is to set some kind of conversation about political correctness is one way to do it. To show we're all valued. There's many other ways to do it, but and I talk about gamifying dissent, for instance. How do you actually make a structure and a game out of disagreement so that it feels safe to like go as hard as you can at each other's ideas
Oh, I love
without
that.
devaluing each other? So yeah, there's a lot of ways to do that as well. But yeah, basically, like, how can I tell you that your idea sucks without telling you that you suck is, figure out the best way to do that and you're in good shape.
That seems like a different issue than the political correctness issue, though.
Yeah.
That seems like a really. I mean, that is like the point you just made there. That's an excellent point. And we want to have diversity. We want people to feel comfortable to disagree with each other. And
Yeah.
not have to feel like everything they say is politically correct.
Well,
So
I'm trying to answer the questions that I want to answer and not answer the questions you're giving me. I don't
that's
really, I don't know the answer. You're probably right. It's a good
that's fair enough.
provocation that you could turn somebody off by enforcing some norms of political correctness or even
Yeah,
discussing it. That is
yeah.
definitely true. So I think it's more of an interesting as a signpost of an idea than maybe an activity to do every day in your organization.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for
Yeah.
writing this book and for chatting with me today.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Psychology Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Also, please add a rating and review of the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the podcast, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.